Thank you, Mrs. Berry. You're awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry! Thank you, Miss Berry. I love you.
You're so awesome.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Berry and Mrs. Swenson.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you, Miss Swenson.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miss Berry.
James says thank you.
Thank you, Miss Berry.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry. Thank you.
Can you say it
Thank
louder?
you.
Go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Swenson.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thanks, Miss Berry and Miss Swenson.
Thank you. Thanking you.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you, Mrs. Swenson.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Berry and Mrs. Swenson. You guys are awesome.
Is it going?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry, for teaching us. Thank you, Mrs. Swenson.
You were a great teacher throughout 6th and 8th grade.
Thanks, Mrs. Berry and Miss Swenson.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry and Mrs. Swenson. You rock.
Mrs. Berry and Miss Swenson, you guys are the best.
Thank you, Mrs. Berry and Mrs. Swenson. And Mackenzie, you're right there.
I love you.
Thanks, Mrs. Swenson.
Hi, Mrs. Berry. Thank you for everything, and band and in sectional. It's really helped me a lot.
Thanks, Miss Berry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Berry.
We love you guys.